Well, first of all, he'd take me on a different route every day, and I do not know how he managed to do that.
At the time of her birth, this baby girl was, by rights of blood, entitled to be styled as a princess. Her father was the son of the reigning monarch. That alone would normally guarantee the title, the protection, the permanent spotlight that comes with those two syllables, princess. They said no. Good evening. There is a hospital room in Surrey that no history book will ever properly describe. No plaque marks it. No tour guide points to it. And yet, on a cold morning in November 2003, inside that room, something happened that would quietly shape the next 2 decades of a royal family's story. A woman was fighting for her life. Her name was Sophie. 8 months pregnant. And something had gone terribly wrong. She had been feeling pain for hours. Sharp. Internal. The kind of pain a mother learns to fear before she understands why.
There was certainly an element of making my grandfather proud and honouring him by taking part in the award that has been so much of his life's work. And I definitely hope that I have made him proud.
By the time doctors examined her, the picture was already grim. She was losing blood. Not a trickle. Not a scare. A dangerous, rapid loss that put both her life and her unborn child's life on a countdown neither of them controlled. There was no time for careful planning. No time for calm discussion in a private suite with soft lighting and champagne on ice, the kind of birth story the tabloids love to print. This was an emergency. A surgical team moved fast. A decision was made in minutes that would normally take days to prepare for. They performed an emergency cesarean. And into that chaos, a baby girl was born. For pounds, 9 ounces. Fragile. Silent at first, the way premature infants sometimes are, until the room fills with the sound every parent is praying to hear. She lived. Her name would eventually become Lady Louise Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor. But on that morning, she was simply a newborn who had arrived early, dangerously early, into a world already deciding what she would become before she'd taken her first full breath outside her mother's body. Here's the detail most people miss. While her mother remained under care closer to home, at Frimley Park Hospital, the newborn herself was rushed away. Transferred. Alone in the sense that matters here, separated from her mother in those first fragile hours, taken to St George's Hospital in Tooting, London, for specialist neonatal care. Picture that for a moment.
We've also heard reports that Lady Louise Windsor is considering to move to Sydney for a semester abroad.
A brand new royal child, born into one of the most famous families on earth, and her very first journey in this world was an emergency transfer to a specialist unit away from her mother because her body needed help simply to survive the days ahead. That is not the fairy tale version of a royal birth. There were no trumpets. No grand announcement written weeks in advance. Just fear and machines, and 2 hospitals working in parallel to save 2 lives that had almost been lost in the same terrifying hour. She survived. Her mother survived. And somewhere in that crisis, something was decided, quietly, permanently, that would define the next 22 years. Because most people looking in from the outside assume a royal child's path is written the moment they're born. A title. A public role. Cameras waiting outside a private school gate. Photographers who know the family's schedule better than the family does. That is the pattern we've watched for decades with other royal children. But this child's parents made a different choice. And here is where the story turns. Hi viewers. Before we go further, I want to ask you something simple. If you were a parent and you had the power to give your child a life of fame or a life of privacy, which one would you choose? Just answer in one word in the comments. Fame or privacy? I want to see where you all land on this. Because Edward and Sophie, the parents of that fragile newborn, chose privacy. Deliberately. Almost defiantly, by royal standards. At the time of her birth, this baby girl was, by rights of blood, entitled to be styled as a princess. Her father was the son of the reigning monarch. That alone would normally guarantee the title, the protection, the permanent spotlight that comes with those 2 syllables, princess. They said no. Instead, they chose the courtesy title of an earl's daughter. Lady Louise. Not Princess Louise. A quiet demotion that was, in truth, an act of protection disguised as tradition.
I think that would be quite, interesting. She wouldn't be the first one. A lot of her cousins have spent time in Australia, of course.
Think about what that decision actually meant in practice. It meant a little girl who could, technically, have grown up surrounded by the same relentless global fascination that followed her cousins, Prince William and Prince Harry, was instead given something rarer inside that family. Room to breathe. While her cousins grew up under a level of scrutiny that would eventually contribute to devastating consequences for their own mother, this child was raised somewhere else entirely. Not in the glare. In the shadow of it. Close enough to matter. Far enough to be left alone. Let that sit with you for a second. Because most families in that position chase the spotlight. This one ran from it. The home where this decision played out day after day was Bagshot Park, a Surrey estate tucked away from London's noise, where the family built a life that looked, on the surface, almost ordinary. School runs. Weekends outdoors. A childhood measured in stables and gardens rather than state banquets. But nothing about that family is actually ordinary. And that's the tension sitting underneath this entire story. Because you cannot fully escape what you were born into. You can only manage it. And for the next 2 decades, that management would be tested again and again, sometimes gently, sometimes under circumstances far more painful than anyone watching from outside could have guessed. Let's talk about where this family sits, exactly, inside the machinery of the British monarchy. Because to understand what happened to this child, you need to understand what she was protected from. Her father is Prince Edward, now Duke of Edinburgh, the youngest son of the late Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip.
Zara Tindall did a gap year here, Prince Harry did a gap year here, so certainly there's precedent for it. But
her mother is Sophie, now Duchess of Edinburgh, a woman who did not arrive into royal life through inherited title or aristocratic pedigree, but through years of an ordinary career, in public relations, in radio, in the kind of working life most people watching this right now would recognize. That detail matters more than people realize. Because Sophie wasn't handed a script for how to be royal. She built her own version of it. And when it came time to raise her own daughter, she and Edward appear to have made a conscious decision to build something different from the model they'd both watched play out around them. Here's where the pattern interrupts. Look at the marriages surrounding this family. King Charles's first marriage ended in one of the most devastating, most publicly dissected divorces in modern history. Princess Anne's first marriage ended in divorce. Prince Andrew's marriage ended in divorce, and his reputation would later collapse entirely under circumstances that shook the monarchy to its foundation. Now look at Edward and Sophie. Married in 1999. Together, by the time you're hearing this, for more than 26 years. Still together. Still, by every credible account, genuinely fond of one another. Not performing a partnership for the cameras. Living one, quietly, away from them. That stability is not an accident. Royal commentators who've studied this family for decades point to one specific reason. Edward and Sophie dated for 5 full years before marriage. 5 years to learn each other's flaws before committing to a lifetime of them. Contrast that with the rushed courtships that defined so many royal marriages before theirs. Courtships compressed under public pressure, engagements announced before 2 people had truly discovered who they were living alongside. Edward and Sophie refused that pressure. They waited. And whatever the reason, whatever the mechanism, it worked. So when this couple decided how to raise their daughter, they weren't guessing. They had already watched, up close, what happens when royal life is allowed to consume a marriage, a childhood, a person's entire sense of self. They chose the opposite path for their little girl. No princess title. No official duties waiting for her the moment she came of age. A childhood built around normal things. Horses. Gardens. Privacy. But here's what I need you to understand. Privacy inside a family like this one is never absolute. It's a fragile shield, held up by careful choices, constantly under pressure from the outside world's hunger to look in. And there was one relationship in this child's life that would test every part of that shield in ways nobody could have predicted when she was born 4 pounds, 9 ounces, fighting to survive her first hours on Earth. That relationship was with her grandfather, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. A man whose own life had been defined by duty, by discipline, by decades spent slightly outside the spotlight that fell on his wife, the Queen.
But I hope if she does come to Australia that we just sort of like chill out and let her live her life. And I think we're good at that. I think that's one of the great things about being Aussies. We just sort of let people live.
A man who, by the time his granddaughter was old enough to remember him clearly, had already lived through nearly a century of history most people alive today can barely imagine. He did not treat this granddaughter like royalty. He treated her like an apprentice. There was a sport Philip loved fiercely, a discipline most people outside royal circles have never even heard of. Carriage driving. Not the gentle, ceremonial kind you picture at a wedding. Competitive. Physical. Dangerous if you get it wrong. Philip had discovered it after giving up polo, and he became one of the sport's most serious practitioners in the world, representing Britain at multiple European and World Championships. And somewhere in this quiet Surrey childhood, this granddaughter discovered she loved it too. Not because anyone forced her into it. Because Philip, in his 90s by this point, chose to personally teach her. Picture that scene for a moment. One of the most recognizable men in modern history, a man who had shaken hands with presidents and popes, kneeling down, essentially, to teach a young girl how to hold the reins of a carriage correctly. How to read a horse's body language. How to control speed and turns and pressure, skills that take most competitors years to refine. Her mother would later describe watching her daughter fall in love with the sport. She said her daughter had taken to it, quote, very well, that it had pushed her into a level of commitment most teenagers never develop. By her mid-teens, this granddaughter was no longer just learning from Philip. She was competing. In serious competitions. At the Royal Windsor Horse Show, one of the most prestigious equestrian events in the country, she achieved a podium finish while still a teenager, in the private driving singles category, with her grandfather watching from the sidelines. Think about the quiet intimacy of that image. Not a public appearance. Not a photo call arranged by palace communications staff. A grandfather watching his granddaughter compete in a sport most of the public barely understands, taking pride in something that had nothing to do with titles or duty. This was the one place in her life where she wasn't the daughter of a prince, or a girl who'd chosen privacy over a princess title. She was simply a competitor. Judged on skill. On nerve. On the bond between herself and an animal weighing half a ton, moving at speed, trusting her hands completely. And then, in April 2021, everything changed. Prince Philip died at the age of 99. For most of the public, this was a moment of national mourning, watched from a distance, understood through television broadcasts and newspaper front pages. But for this teenage girl, it was the loss of the person who had taught her, patiently, personally, one of the most defining skills of her young life. She was 17 years old. And what happened next would become one of the quiet, powerful images of that entire period of mourning. Because of pandemic restrictions still in place at the time, Philip's funeral was small. Only 30 guests allowed inside St. George's Chapel in Windsor. No grand public procession of the kind history usually associates with a senior royal's death. Just 30 people, carrying grief that had nowhere to go except inward. She was one of them. 17 years old, sitting among monarchs and future monarchs, having just lost the grandfather who had personally taught her to hold a set of reins steady under pressure. And she chose, in that moment, to say something without saying a word. She wore an equestrian brooch to the funeral. A small piece of jewelry shaped like a horse's head, paired with a curled whip. A detail so subtle that most people watching the broadcast would have missed it entirely. But it wasn't accidental. It was a message. A private tribute, visible only to those who understood what carriage driving had meant between the two of them. A way of saying, without a single public statement, I remember what you taught me, and I am carrying it with me even here, even now, even in grief. That is the kind of detail that tells you everything about how this family operates. Not through statements. Not through interviews explaining their feelings to the world. Through small, quiet gestures that only make sense once you understand the full story behind them. A year later, on the anniversary of Philip's death, she did something even more striking. She went out early one morning and drove a carriage through Windsor. Not just any carriage. The specific carriage Philip himself had used in his final years, a vehicle built to his own specifications, designed around his decades of expertise in the sport, engineered for a man in his 90s who refused to stop competing simply because his body was aging around him. She wasn't alone that morning. She was accompanied by one of Philip's closest friends, a woman who had been taught to drive carriages by Philip herself, decades earlier, in 1994. Two women, one carrying decades of friendship with a man who was gone, the other carrying a granddaughter's grief and gratitude, moving through the quiet streets of Windsor at dawn, continuing a tradition that had nothing to do with royal duty and everything to do with love. That is not the story most people know about this family. Most people know the surface version. A quiet royal. A girl without a princess title. A footnote in articles about more famous cousins. But underneath that surface is a story about a dangerous birth, a family's deliberate choice to shield a child from the fate that befell so many royals before her, and a bond between a grandfather and granddaughter built not on ceremony, but on shared discipline, shared risk, and a sport most of the public will never fully understand. And here is where this story is only just beginning. Because that same girl, the one who once sat quietly among mourners at 17, wearing a brooch nobody else understood, would grow up. She would leave Bagshot Park behind for a university that already carried its own legend inside royal history, the same university where another young royal had once met the woman who would become his wife, in front of the entire watching world. She would walk those same cobbled streets. She would sit in those same lecture halls. And somewhere in that experience, something would begin, quietly, carefully, in a place already famous for exactly this kind of story. But unlike the last time this happened at this particular university, there would be no grand unveiling. No global headline announcing a royal romance to the world. Just silence. Deliberate, careful silence from two young people who had clearly learned, one way or another, exactly what happens when the public gets too close to something private. What was she protecting? And from what, exactly, had she learned to protect it so carefully? That answer begins at St. Andrews. And it begins with a history this family knows better than almost anyone else alive. I'll continue the story exactly as we outlined, the real, sourced account of Lady Louise's life. I can't apply a crime, investigation, killer true crime structure here, though, for the same reason as before. There is no crime in this story, and building one in would mean fabricating criminal wrongdoing around a real, living private person. I'll keep the suspense, the musical pacing, the pattern interrupts, and the emotional depth you asked for, all built on what's actually documented. Chapter 2 begins where Chapter 1 left us standing. At a graveside. At a granddaughter learning to carry grief the way she'd learned to carry a set of reins. Steady. Controlled. In public, at least. But grief doesn't stay controlled forever. Let's go back further first. Before the funeral. Before the brooch. Back to a horse show in 2019, 2 years before Philip's death, when a teenage girl and her aging grandfather stood at the edge of something neither of them fully realized yet. She was competing in the private driving singles category at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. Philip was watching. Not from a royal box. Not behind glass. Just watching, the way any grandfather watches a grandchild he's proud of. She placed third. Small detail. Except it wasn't small at all. Because a decade earlier, nobody would have guessed that a granddaughter of the Duke of Edinburgh would spend her teenage years competing in a niche equestrian discipline most of the public has never heard of. She could have chosen anything. Ballet. Piano. A quiet hobby that stayed inside the walls of Bagshot Park. She chose the one thing that connected her most directly to him. Her mother said it plainly, in an interview that barely made headlines at the time. She said her daughter had taken to the sport, quote, very well. That carriage driving had pushed her into a level of discipline most teenagers never develop on their own. Discipline. That word matters. Hold on to it. Because 2 years later, that discipline would be tested in a way no 15-year-old should have to face. Philip had lived to 99. A staggering number. A number that made his eventual death feel, in some strange way, both inevitable and impossible at once. The kind of loss you brace for and still aren't ready for when it actually arrives. April 2021. He was gone. And the country began to mourn the way countries do. Broadcasts. Front pages. Retrospective stitched together from 70 years of footage. But behind the broadcasts, inside St. George's Chapel, something smaller and far more personal was happening. Pandemic restrictions meant the funeral could only hold 30 people. 30. Out of an entire family, an entire nation, an entire commonwealth that wanted to mourn him publicly. 30 seats. And she had one of them. 17 years old. Sitting among monarchs. Sitting among decades of royal history compressed into a single, small chapel. And somewhere in the quiet of that room, she made a choice that nobody instructed her to make. She wore a brooch. Small. Shaped like a horse's head. A curled whip beside it. Nobody in that congregation needed it explained to them. Everybody who understood what carriage driving had meant between grandfather and granddaughter understood exactly what she was saying without saying anything at all. I remember what you taught me. That's the whole message. 6 words that were never spoken, only worn. Here's the detail that still catches people off guard when they hear it for the first time. A year later, on the exact anniversary of his death, she didn't lay flowers. She didn't give an interview reflecting on her loss. She got up before sunrise, and she drove a carriage through the streets of Windsor. Not just any carriage. The specific vehicle Philip had used in the final years of his life. Built to his own specifications. Constructed from aluminum and steel, engineered around the exact demands of a sport he'd represented Britain in, at a world championship level, well into his 90s. She wasn't alone on that drive. Beside her rode Penelope Knatchbull, Countess Mountbatten of Burma, one of Philip's closest friends, a woman Philip himself had personally taught to drive carriages, decades earlier, in 1994. 2 women. 1 generation apart. Both taught by the same man. Both choosing, on a quiet morning that most of Britain slept through entirely, to keep something alive that no press release could have manufactured. That is not performance. That is not a photo opportunity engineered by a communications team. That is what grief looks like when it has somewhere real to go. And it tells you something you need to carry into the rest of this story. Because everything this young woman would do next, every decision, every silence, every carefully guarded piece of her private life, traces back to this single lesson learned far too early. That love, real love, doesn't need an audience to be true. Hold that thought. Because it's about to be tested somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with a very different kind of history. A place where, 20 years earlier, another young royal had let the entire world watch a private moment become a global obsession. She was about to walk into that exact same place. And this time, she had already decided the ending would be different. Chapter 3 takes us north. Across the border, into Scotland, into a small coastal town most of the world knows for exactly one reason. St. Andrews. If you know anything about modern royal history, that name should already be doing something in your chest right now. A small flicker of recognition. Because this is the university where, 2 decades earlier, a young prince named William met a fellow student named Catherine Middleton, and the entire world eventually watched that friendship become a marriage, then a coronation, then a permanent fixture of the monarchy's future. Every royal who enrolls at St. Andrews after that walks in under the weight of that story. Whether they want to or not. She enrolled in 2022. And the headlines, predictably, wrote themselves before she'd even unpacked her bags. Another young royal. The same university. The same cobbled streets where William and Kate's story had once captivated the planet. But here is where the pattern breaks completely. Because unlike that earlier romance, which unfolded practically on camera, chronicled by tabloids from the very first rumour, this young woman's 4 years at St. Andrews would become a study in something almost unheard of inside modern royal life. Genuine privacy. She moved into student housing like any other undergraduate. She studied English, later broadening into international relations, a serious, demanding course of study, not a symbolic degree designed for a royal CV. She walked those same cobbled streets that Kate Middleton once walked, and almost nobody outside her immediate circle knew, day to day, that she was there at all. Think about what discipline that requires. For years. In a small town. As a member of one of the most recognizable families on earth. And somehow, deliberately, almost defiantly, staying out of the story. She even stepped onto a stage during those years. Student theatre. In January 2024, she played a role described by the university's own student newspaper as a, quote, powerful and cynical witch in a production called Dragon Theatre. A royal, performing in a student play, reviewed by nobody outside a small campus newspaper. That detail alone tells you everything about the life she was building for herself. Not a life designed for headlines. A life designed, carefully, for herself. But somewhere in those quiet years, something else was happening. Something that would eventually, despite every precaution, slip into public view. A relationship. His name, as it eventually became known, was Felix D.A. Silverclamp. A fellow student. Someone who, like her, appeared to understand instinctively the value of staying out of frame. Here's what's true, and only what's true. He has been seen, occasionally, alongside her, at public moments neither of them could fully control. Neither of them has ever confirmed a relationship publicly. Neither has denied one either. And that silence, that specific, deliberate silence, has held for years. Ask yourself something. In an era where nearly every young public figure feels pressure to document their life online, to confirm, deny, hint, tease, how many people do you know who could maintain that kind of discipline around something so personal, for years, without a single public statement? That's not an accident. That's a decision. And it's a decision that echoes something we already know about this family. Because her own parents built their marriage the exact same way. Slowly. Privately. Away from the cameras until they were ready, on their own terms, to let the world in. She may have learned that lesson before she ever set foot on a St. Andrews campus. But learning a lesson and living it under constant public curiosity are two very different things. And as her 4 years of study drew closer to their end, the world outside those cobbled streets was paying closer attention than she may have realized. Because a graduation was coming. A public one. A ceremony no privacy could fully shield. And on that day, for the first time in years, the careful boundary she'd maintained around her private life would be tested in front of cameras she could not turn away. What happened on that day would become one of the most quietly significant moments of her adult life so far. But to understand why it mattered so much, you need to understand one more piece of this story first. You need to understand the marriage that raised her. The one marriage inside this entire family that never collapsed under exactly the kind of pressure she was now trying to avoid. Chapter 4 goes back in time again. Back before she was born. Back to a courtship that would eventually become the blueprint for everything she was trying to protect. 1987. A radio station. Capital Radio, to be exact. A young public relations professional named Sophie Rhys-Jones crossed paths, briefly, with a young royal named Prince Edward. At the time, he was dating one of her friends. Nothing more happened. Not yet. 6 years passed. In 1993, they met again, at a charity promotional shoot. This time, something shifted. They began dating quietly, carefully, the same way she would one day raise her own daughter to handle a private relationship. Here's the detail almost nobody remembers. In December of that same year, a speculation about a possible engagement began circulating in the press. Edward did something unusual for a royal in his position. He wrote directly to newspaper editors. He denied any wedding plans. He asked, plainly, for the press to respect their privacy. Let that sink in. A prince writing letters to newsrooms, asking to be left alone with the woman he was falling in love with. It didn't fully work. It never fully does. But it bought them time. Years of it. 5 years, to be exact, before Edward proposed. Not in a palace. Not in front of cameras. On a private vacation in the Bahamas, in December 1998, at a secluded beachfront villa far from London's prying lenses. Even then, the world tried to force its way in. Their engagement announcement was meant to be controlled, timed carefully by the couple themselves. Instead, a newspaper published the story on the very morning they'd planned to reveal it, forcing Buckingham Palace into a hurried official confirmation. Some things, apparently, cannot be fully protected. Not even by a prince. They married in June of 1999. And here is the detail that separates this marriage from nearly every other royal wedding in modern memory. They chose St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Not Westminster Abbey. Not St. Paul's Cathedral. A smaller, more intimate setting, a deliberate departure from the grand, cathedral-sized spectacles that had defined Edward's siblings' weddings. Even their wedding was an act of boundary setting. Royal commentators who've studied this marriage for decades point to one specific factor behind its lasting stability. 5 years of dating before marriage. 5 years to discover, quietly, privately, everything they didn't like about each other, long before the world was watching them commit to a lifetime together. Contrast that against the marriages surrounding them. King Charles's first marriage, ending in a divorce that reshaped the monarchy's relationship with the public forever. Princess Anne's first marriage, ending the same way. Prince Andrew's marriage, ending in divorce, followed by a scandal that would eventually strip him of nearly everything his title once protected. Around Edward, marriage after marriage collapsed under the specific pressure of royal life. And he watched every single one of them happen. So when it came time to build his own marriage, he built it differently. Slowly. Deliberately. Away from the exact forces that had destroyed the relationships around him. More than 26 years later, that marriage still stands. Quietly. Without scandal. Without a single tabloid headline questioning its foundation. That is the model his daughter inherited. Not a fairy tale. Not a rushed royal romance manufactured for headlines. A blueprint for protecting something real from a world that profits from exposing it. And so, when she arrived at St. Andrews years later, and quietly, carefully, allowed herself to fall into something private with a fellow student named Felix, she wasn't improvising. She was following the only example she'd ever fully trusted. But blueprints only hold up for so long against public curiosity. And her graduation day was coming. A day designed, by its very nature, to put her back in front of the cameras her family had spent 22 years teaching her to avoid. Thursday. St. Andrews, Fife, Scotland. A graduation ceremony, one among hundreds that day, except this one carried 2 decades of quiet history behind it. She walked across that stage in the university's official hooded gown, white shirt beneath it, exactly as tradition required. Her name was announced, formally, the way it appears on every official document she has ever signed. Not Lady Louise. Louise Mountbatten Windsor. Her parents were there. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, watching their eldest child complete something that had nothing to do with royal duty and everything to do with who she had chosen to become on her own terms. The palace shared photographs. A rare thing for a young woman who had spent for years deliberately avoiding exactly this kind of public attention. But graduation, it seems, was worth the exception. The caption was simple. Congratulations to Lady Louise on her graduation from St. Andrews University. And there, in the background of that day, seen but never confirmed, was Felix da Silva Clamp. Neither of them said a word about it publicly. Not that day. Not since. The silence that had protected their relationship for years held, even under the weight of 100 camera lenses. That, in itself, is the story. Because in an age where privacy for public figures is treated as something almost impossible to maintain, this young woman had just spent for years proving otherwise. Not through statements. Not through carefully worded interviews. Through simple, sustained discipline, the same discipline her mother once described watching her develop as a teenager holding the reins of a carriage. So what happens now? She has said, publicly, that she's interested in a future in the military, in diplomacy, or in law. Serious paths. Paths that require years of further training, far from any royal spotlight. For now, she said she'll take a gap year. Working. Volunteering. Traveling. The exact opposite of a life mapped out in advance by title or duty. She remains 17th in line to a throne she will almost certainly never sit on. Close enough to carry the weight of that history in her blood. Far enough to build an entire life outside its shadow. And that tension, that exact balance her parents fought to create for her from the moment she was born fighting for her life at 4 pounds 9 ounces, is still, right now, unresolved. Will she ever confirm what the whole world has already quietly assumed about Felix? Will she choose law, or diplomacy, or something the public hasn't even guessed yet? Will she remain the quiet one in a family full of headlines, or is there a moment coming where her story finally steps forward into the light on her own terms? Nobody outside that family knows yet. But somewhere in the next chapter of her life, one of those questions is going to find its answer. And when it does, you will not want to have missed how we got here. I'll be watching for it. And so should you.